They say the forests of Washington hold far more than towering evergreens and fog-shrouded trails. Out in the deep darkness, something watches. Something that doesn't like intruders and isn't shy about letting it be known. Let's dive into 3 haunting accounts from the shadows of the Cascades and the Olympic Peninsula, where blood-curdling screams echo beneath ancient canopies and footprints larger than any boot print sink into the muddy ground. Some whisper it's a legendary Bigfoot. Others suspect a feral being, maybe even a lost soul turned savage. Or is it something else? Something so terrifying it defies explanation. Welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and become part of our ever-growing community of the curious. Now prepare yourself, because what you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. I read somewhere that around 1,600 people are missing in the wild right now, across national and state forests throughout the United States, and every year, new names get added to that list. It's a sobering thought, but I've always figured most of those might be due to people not following safe hiking practices or getting lost in the elements. Now I'm not so sure. After what I've seen, I'm starting to wonder if there might be more to it. I'm telling you this because something's been nagging at me ever since my last trip up near Mount Baker National Forest. I don't usually get rattled by the outdoors, especially around a place I've known since I was small, but this time felt different. Like the air was thicker, or something was just off. I guess I just want to share this in case someone else has experienced anything similar or has some explanation. I was hiking around the Damfino Lakes area, about 20 miles southeast of the Canadian border. It's a place I've gone several times over the years. Normally, it's quiet and beautiful, with mossy logs and gentle streams. I like to go there to clear my head, sometimes even fish if the weather's right. But this recent trip was anything but relaxing. There was a darkness to the woods that felt almost alive, like the forest itself was watching. It might sound dramatic, but that feeling you get when something is staring at you from just out of sight, that was constant. This all started when I was driving into town, a little place called Maple Falls, just a few miles from the National Forest boundary. I noticed a few missing person flyers tacked up at the general store's notice board. A young man named Neil had vanished on a trail. The date on the flyer was pretty recent, less than a week ago. That gave me pause because I was planning to hike right in that area. Everyone seemed edgy too. The cashier at the store told me she overheard the local search and rescue group talking about how all they found was a lone backpack near a trail intersection, and something about it didn't look like a simple accident. The bag was ripped in a way that didn't quite make sense, like raw force had torn it open, not just wear and tear. I figured maybe a bear was responsible. Bears can get curious, right? But the cashier just shrugged and said, "You be careful out there," with a look that made the hair on my neck prickle. I set out later that afternoon. The weather was typical Pacific Northwest gloom, drizzly with low-hanging fog curling around the evergreens. Even the woods seemed quieter than usual, except for the occasional drip of water off the leaves and branches. Usually, you hear birds or squirrels rustling around, but I swear there were moments when the silence felt like a weight pressing on my ears. Around 5 in the evening, I noticed a weird smell in the air, like wet fur mixed with something foul, almost like rotting meat. At first, I thought maybe I'd stumbled upon a dead deer or something, but when I looked around, I found nothing. I kept walking, but that smell never fully went away. Instead, it trailed behind me in a faint, sickly way. Right before dusk, I ran into a park ranger. He looked weary, like he'd been up all night. He asked if I'd seen anything unusual. I sort of laughed it off, saying, "Well, the forest feels weird today, but nothing concrete." Then he told me in a low, shaky voice that he and his partner had come across footprints earlier that day, bare footprints that were enormous, way bigger than any normal person's. He said they seemed to follow the tree line for about half a mile and then disappeared near a rocky outcrop. He said to be careful, and that it was best to head back before dark. The way he spoke, like he was trying not to spook me, only made me more uneasy. That night, I barely slept. I stayed in a small cabin I'd rented in Glacier. Around midnight, I heard distant thumps coming from the woods. It sounded almost like someone was pounding on a tree with a heavy log. I'd never heard anything like it before. It didn't match the rhythm of an animal scavenging or normal branches falling. It was more deliberate. Thump, pause. Thump, thump. My mind went to those local legends about Bigfoot, the supposed tree knocks that some folks talk about. Normally, I'd brush that off, but in that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. The next day, more rumors floated around town about the missing hiker. Some said they'd found strange tufts of hair snagged on branches near the last known point he was seen. Another rumor was that there were claw marks etched into the bark of a nearby tree, the gouges fresh and deep. A local man who runs a small guiding service claimed to have come across a partial footprint. He didn't want to believe it was anything unusual, but he also admitted it was like nothing he'd seen before. Wide, with spaced-out toes and a heel impression that sank noticeably deeper than the rest. I caught a second park ranger heading out of the station that afternoon. He quietly confided that he'd seen what he could only describe as a dark figure moving between the trees at dusk just 2 nights prior. He couldn't tell exactly how tall it was, but it was definitely large, and it moved in a way that reminded him of a man, only bigger, heavier, and faster than any person he'd seen. He'd called out, but the figure vanished so fast it felt impossible. He said he tried to follow the footprints but lost them among the dense brush. He mentioned how easy it is for people to vanish, especially in areas where the undergrowth is thick, but even he seemed spooked by the possibility that something else might be lurking out there. By the time I was done talking to folks, I felt a growing sense of dread. I went back into the forest one more time, just to see if I could find anything for myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wanted me gone. Every creak of a branch, every flutter of a bird's wing made my heart pound. I know it sounds paranoid, but when you're out there, surrounded by ancient firs and towering cedars, it feels like you're in someone else's domain, like you're a trespasser. And if all these stories hold any truth, maybe we're not the ones at the top of the food chain in certain parts of these woods. So, that's what happened. I didn't see anything with my own eyes beyond shifting shapes in the corner of my vision, but sometimes that's enough to raise every alarm bell in your body. I do know that missing hikers are not uncommon in our national forests, but this situation seems too strange to chalk up to a simple accident. I keep thinking about that smell and the shredded backpack, and I can't forget the ranger's face when he talked about those footprints, as if part of him wished he could unsee them. Maybe this will help someone else who goes wandering near Mount Baker, or maybe it'll just confirm that something beyond our understanding roams those shadowy glades. If you plan to head out there, be prepared, stay alert, and if your gut says turn around, listen to it. Those tall, dark trees might hide more secrets than we're ready to learn. I don't know if the missing hiker will ever be found or if the truth behind these sightings will come to light, but 1,600 people are missing in the wild right now, and I'm not sure it'll ever feel like the peaceful escape it once was. Next up is a story about a man that was looking forward to a simple hunting trip, a chance to breathe in the crisp mountain air and maybe bring home a trophy. But deep in the shadowy heart of the North Cascades, one man came face to face with something beyond terrifying. What he found in those woods will forever haunt him. I've been hesitant to write this down and send it to you, but the nightmares won't go away. So, I'm taking a leap and telling the whole story, hoping someone out there might have a clue as to what I really saw. I was hunting in North Cascades National Park, off a rarely used game trail near Ross Lake. I like going off the beaten path because the deer are less spooked, and I usually find better spots. I've done this for years without a hitch, but this time was different. Worse than anything I've ever experienced. It all started late last October. The leaves were damp, and an early morning fog hung low across the treetops. Even though the forecast called for clear skies by midday, the forest stayed dark like twilight for hours. I remember the quiet most of all, an unnatural hush that settled over everything. No birds, no squirrels. A few hours in, I barely saw any signs of deer. The day felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I stepped into a small clearing around noon. The sun pierced through a gap in the canopy, and that's when I noticed the first sign of trouble. Deep footprints, bigger than any I've seen. Each print looked longer than my forearm, and you could see toes. They pressed into the mud like something heavy had passed through. My breath caught for a second, but I told myself it might just be a bear's track that got misshapen in the mud. I kept walking. Then I caught a sick, rancid stench. It reminded me of meat left to rot in the sun, mixed with old sweat. I glanced around and spotted a trail of half-eaten animal remains. Small bones, twisted flesh. The scene was disgusting. There was a chunk of fur snagged on a tree trunk, matted with dried blood. I've stumbled on predator kills before, but this felt cruel, like it had been tossed around for no good reason. Everything about it screamed that I should turn back, but I kept going, hoping I'd stumble across some sign that could explain all this. Not far from there, I found a sort of makeshift shelter. It had thick branches leaning against each other, forming a weird triangular hideout. The inside was littered with bits of bone and strips of hide that smelled like they'd been there a while. Some bones looked fresh, others older, yellowed, and brittle. It was all laid out in this bizarre pattern. Not random like what you see when animals scatter remains. It felt intentional, like someone arranged them. My gut twisted, and I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. That's when I heard a low growl echo from the trees behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. It was tall, covered in shaggy dark hair, but at times it almost looked like a filthy human. The arms were way too long, and the face had some flattened features, but the eyes, those eyes were too intelligent for a regular animal. I couldn't tell if it was a Bigfoot or some wild feral person who'd lost their mind living in the forest. Either way, I froze. It bared its teeth, stained and yellow, and let out this horrible snarl that vibrated in my chest. I raised my rifle, more out of panic than anything. My hands trembled, and I wondered if one bullet would even do any good against something like that. Before I could decide whether to shoot or shout, it lunged forward. I didn't fire. I just bolted. I was too terrified to think straight. My boots slipped on the muddy ground as I raced back toward where I thought the main trail was. Branches whipped my face, and I nearly lost my footing on a slick rock. Behind me, I heard heavy stomps and panting. It wasn't that clumsy crashing of a bear. It sounded more purposeful, like it knew exactly how to chase me through the underbrush. Every few seconds I heard a guttural grunt or snarl, and each time it sent a jolt of cold fear through my veins. At one point I glanced back. Biggest mistake I could have made. That thing was so close, I caught sight of its eyes, gleaming with anger or hunger. I can't forget how it moved, an unsteady mix of upright and hunched, arms swinging wildly, fingers curled like claws. I felt like a deer being hunted. My brain shouted that I was done for. Somehow, luck was on my side. I reached a steep slope near the edge of a rocky creek. I slid down, half tumbling, branches scratching my arms, rocks scraping my knees. I heard that creature let out a screech that made my hair stand on end. The screech turned into this weird howling that echoed off the canyon walls. It felt like it was furious that I'd gotten away. Or maybe just warning me never to come back. I didn't stop until I hit the creek bed. My lungs burned, and I tasted blood where I'd bitten my lip. I waited for the thing to follow me down, rifle clutched to my chest. But after a long minute, the forest went still again. I wasn't alone, though. I could sense it up on the ridge, watching, deciding if I was worth the trouble. I scrambled downstream until I finally found a place where I could climb back up. Dazed and drenched, I stumbled onto a more familiar trailhead. A couple of hikers saw me and asked if I was okay. I could barely form sentences, but they could tell something had me spooked. Later, in town, I tried explaining that I'd seen something monstrous out there. People gave me wary looks. Some shook their heads, said I must have seen a bear. But there were a few who nodded knowingly, like they'd heard stories or had their own experiences. One older local quietly mentioned that folks sometimes talk about a feral clan living way out in the wild, completely removed from society, rumored to be violent. Others claim it's the infamous Bigfoot roaming the Cascades. Whichever version you believe, it isn't good news for anyone who crosses its path. I'm certain of one thing. The presence I felt in those woods had an intelligence and a rage that no ordinary bear would have. And I'll never forget that makeshift shelter, those twisted piles of bones that seemed almost ritualistic, the smell that got so deep in my nose I could taste it. I'm sharing this because I don't want anyone else stumbling into the same nightmare. If you're headed to the North Cascades, be careful. If you see footprints that don't look right or catch a whiff of that rotting stench, turn around. Don't do what I did. I barely made it out, and I can't help but think about what might have happened if I tripped at the wrong moment or if it had a bit more determination. Anyway, I'm done hunting in that part of the park for good. So, a hunter in the North Cascades stumbles upon a grotesque makeshift camp filled with bones and meets a towering beast, possibly a feral human or Bigfoot. So frightening. I would love to hear what you think it was in the comments below. In this next story, a simple weekend trip turned into a waking nightmare when something in those woods started screaming. Now the question is, what truly lurks in the lonely dark of this national park? I'm not a super experienced camper, but I've done enough overnights in Washington's backcountry to know the usual sounds. Owls hooting, the rush of a nearby stream, maybe a startled deer crashing through underbrush. But this was something else, something that still sends a chill down my spine when I think about it. I'd driven out from Seattle on Friday afternoon, hoping to snag a quiet campsite near the Hoh Rainforest area. The drive was pretty normal. Highways, small towns, that last stretch where the cell signal gets spotty. It was late spring, so the sun stayed out longer, but the tall trees made it feel like dusk was falling early. I set up my tent in a spot not too far from the Hoh River, where I could hear the water lapping against rocks. I thought it would lull me to sleep. The first night was mostly peaceful, though I remember waking up around 2 a.m. because the forest had gone dead silent. It was like someone pressed the mute button on nature. No crickets, no wind, nothing. I dozed off eventually, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The second day, I went on a short hike along the Hoh River Trail. Met a couple of hikers who mentioned hearing odd noises at night, but shrugged it off. I didn't think much of it then, but now I wish I'd asked more questions. The whole area had an eerie vibe, like the ferns and moss were watching. Maybe that's just the rainforest atmosphere. That night, around 11 p.m., I was reading in my tent when I heard the first scream. It sounded distant, but it was long and guttural, like a high-pitched roar. Not a coyote, not an elk. It was more like a person screaming in pain, but too deep and resonant to be human. My heart started pounding like I'd run a marathon. I grabbed my flashlight and just sat there, debating if I should unzip the tent and investigate or if I should stay put. A minute later, another scream tore through the woods, closer this time. It had this strange echo, like it was bouncing off the giant trees and circling back. I tried to record it on my phone, but my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I managed to hit record just before the next scream came. I've listened to it since, and it still gives me nightmares. Some folks might think it's just a big cat or a wounded animal, but it sure didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. I finally worked up the courage to peek out of my tent, shining my flashlight into the blackness. Everything looked normal, just the tall silhouettes of trees swaying slightly. But there was a weird smell drifting on the breeze, like stale sweat mixed with rotten vegetation. It got stronger, making my stomach churn. I remember feeling that tight grip of fear, like I was in someone else's territory and they weren't happy about it. Then I noticed movement farther down the trail. I couldn't see it clearly, just a large shape slipping between the trees. It was big, at least as tall as a person, but the shoulders seemed wider, and the way it moved was unsettling, kind of hunched but fast. I didn't wait to see more. I ducked back into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to stay as quiet as possible. As I sat there, breath held, I heard rustling. It circled around my campsite like it was pacing. Twigs snapped under the weight of something heavier than a person, or maybe it was a person. Just a big one. The idea crossed my mind that maybe it was a feral human living in the forest, or maybe the stories about Bigfoot aren't just stories. My heart wouldn't stop hammering. If it came any closer, I wasn't sure what I'd do. After what felt like hours, though it was probably just a few minutes, everything went quiet again. I stayed up the rest of the night, barely breathing, listening for the slightest sound. I thought about grabbing my car keys and making a run for it, but I kept imagining whatever it was lurking just outside the beam of my flashlight. By dawn, I packed up as fast as possible. On my way to the parking lot, I met a ranger who asked if I was all right because I looked pale. I tried explaining I'd heard these horrible screams, recorded them on my phone. The ranger gave me a concerned look and said, "Folks sometimes report strange sounds out here, but usually it's just wildlife." I could tell they were trying to keep me calm, or maybe not feed into any wild stories, but they seemed uneasy, like they'd heard it all before. When I got back to Seattle, I played the recording for a couple of friends. One said it sounded like a bear, but the other swore it was no bear. A co-worker told me there have always been rumors of mysterious creatures in the Olympic Mountains, especially around remote spots where people rarely go. I'm not saying it's definitely Bigfoot, but it sure wasn't normal. That scream had a haunted, almost desperate quality. The memory of that shape slipping between the trees still makes the hairs on my arms stand up. I don't know what I saw, but something out there let me know it wasn't happy I was on its turf. Maybe there's a perfectly logical explanation, or maybe some parts of these forests hold secrets we'd rather not uncover. Anyway, I'm sharing this because I don't want anyone else stumbling into the same situation unprepared. If you're camping in Olympic National Park and you hear that scream, pay attention. Don't brush it off as just the wind. If you smell that foul odor and notice how the forest itself seems to close in around you, pack up and leave. Trust me, you don't want to find out what's on the other side of that darkness. And so, another strange encounter fades away. A trick of the mind, or something far more unsettling. That's for you to decide. Thank you so much for watching my stories. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support is what keeps this channel going.